This time it's 10 of the world's most expensive motorcycles. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really does help us create more content. These days, if you want to spend an obscene amount of money on a motorcycle, frankly it's easy. You could buy an MV, a new Ducati, a BMW, even a supercharged Kawasaki will all set you back an enormous amount of cash if that's what you're into. But what about the classic and older motorcycle market? Essentially, how much money could you spend if you really went for it in the second-hand market? Now for this video I'm not going to publish prices because the thing is so fluid at the moment that the prices will be completely wrong by next week. The Buff Superior SS100. The Buff Superior SS100 is undoubtedly the least surprising bike that will appear on this list. Pretty much anybody that's done a video about expensive motorcycles is going to include one. And that would include, of course, the modern reimagining. Even that's expensive. The company was founded by George Brough in 1919. His first model had been the SS80, which was a side valve version capable of, well, surprisingly 80 miles an hour. His most famous model is, of course, the overhead valve SS100, capable of a tested 100 miles an hour, and each machine was provided with a certificate to testify that it had indeed reached that magic number. Now the bikes had been described as bitters because, let's face it, they were made of predominantly bought-in parts, but that was true of a number of V-twin manufacturers of the period also. But his machines were finally put together and very beautifully styled with their nickel tanks. And with their V-twin Jap engines, they were very much the superbikes of the era. The general sports bike had been a 500cc single in that period, but the litre class V-twin of course offered more power and greater flexibility, although an admittedly much heavier package. They were also much longer too, and in the 1920s around circuits like Brookland, that long wheelbase, given the suspension and chassis technology of the day, was a real boon. They were much more stable and therefore very successful, unsurprisingly. But perhaps George's greatest skill, and one which is very much underrated today, was his understanding of the market and his ability to promote both his machines and the company. This doesn't mean he's a motorcycling equivalent to P.T. Barnum, of course, but it does mean he had a good grasp of the market and how to promote his brand, a lesson which perhaps the other manufacturers of big V-twins should have taken. And of course the machine's association with T. Lawrence didn't do the bike any harm at all. But production numbers of the SS100 were extremely low, with production of both the Jap and matchless engine machines totalling just 383 units between 1924 and 1940. One interesting point is that the SS80 side valve is much more common, with over 1,000 units actually being manufactured. Unsurprisingly, this is because the machine was a fair bit cheaper than the SS100, and in fact wasn't even the most expensive large side valve V-twin on the market, and so by Brough Superior standards at least, could be described as competitively priced. Although sadly, that's not the case today, of course. By the end of the 30s, the market was becoming increasingly difficult for Brough Superior. A number of much smaller, lighter machines were catching up in terms of performance. And in the brave new world of speed twins and Tiger 100s, the V-twin was beginning to look a bit old hat. And post-war, where would Brough Superior have found an engine? Matchless had very much moved over to parallel twins, the same as everybody else. The market, it seemed, had moved on. The Henderson IV. Now the Henderson Motor Company was founded by two brothers, William and Tom, in 1911 in Detroit, Michigan. The first prototype machine had been a single-cylinder unit. However, in 1912 they introduced their first four. This was a 57 cubic inch or 934cc engine with inlet over exhaust valve arrangement and was rated at 7 horsepower. And it was this machine that was used by Carl Stearns Francie in 1913 and one of the first successful attempts to circumnavigate the globe by motorcycle. 1914 we see the introduction of a 2-speed transmission system housed within the rear wheel hub. And this would remain in use until 1917 and the introduction of the Model G, which featured a more traditional 3-speed gearbox as well as automatic wet sump lubrication, in a machine which by 1918 had grown to 67 cubic inches or 1100 cc's. 1917 was also the year that the brothers sold out to Ignis Svim, the famous bicycle producer. While Bill Henderson did stay on for a while, he would later leave acrimoniously and would develop his own machines under the Ace banner. From this point on, the machines got larger and more powerful and would prove very popular with American police forces, with later machines capable of over 100 miles an hour, making these machines rare and very desirable, especially stateside. The Munch Mammoth. Introduced in 1966, the Munch Mammoth, that's German for mammoth, is often described as the world's first production road-going four-cylinder motorcycle. Now this is stretching a point somewhat because production volumes were absolutely tiny. The machine was the brainchild of one Friedel Munch, apologies for the pronunciation of course, who installed a 996cc NSU air-cooled overhead cam car engine into a chassis of his own design and manufacture. The rear of the chassis and the wheels both used aluminium alloys and were cast in-house, as were the magnesium brake drums. The rest of the frame was a tubular steel design based on Norton's featherbed. Now that overhead cam engine was a weighty old thing, but the machine weighed in at a not unreasonable 480 pounds thanks to the use of exotic materials in the rolling chassis. In 1968 the machine gained an even larger engine of 1177cc, which with tuning gave an impressive 88 horsepower. But this engine would also see the machine's weight rise to 650 pounds. 1973 was an even larger machine of 1200cc, which gave out 100 horsepower. But this was a very low volume, very high spec machine, with consequently high prices. And by 1975, when the final machines rolled out of the factory, there were an awful lot of four-cylinder bikes that one could choose from for an awful lot less money than the mighty Mammoth. The MTT Y2K. The Y2K is perhaps the most bonkers machine in the entire list, making use of a jet turbine engine producing around 350 shaft horsepower. The bike first appeared in the year 2000 and has been in production in limited numbers ever since. Later machines produce an even more impressive 420 horsepower, and because of the ludicrous performance of the bike, it dispensed with mirrors, instead using a rear view camera. But ultimately, the gas turbine is not an engine best suited to motorcycle use. It needs to spool up to ridiculous RPMs before it actually gets moving, and of course there's no engine braking. Shut the throttle and you'll just keep going for miles. And of course, it's no lightweight. But let's not forget the jet engine is not the most fuel efficient device, so the machine requires a 34 litre, that's 9 US gallon fuel tank. But then if you can afford one, I expect you can afford to fuel it too. The Bimotor V8. Let's face it, there's no such thing as an inexpensive bimotor. The company's been producing high quality products for decades now, but they would come unstuck with the development of their V-twin two-stroke. Now Bimotor had always used brought-in motors, so when it was announced in the late 90s that they were developing their own two-stroke motor, it caused more than a few raised eyebrows. The engine was a 499cc and was a 90-degree liquid-cooled V-twin stroker with reed valve induction. It featured twin crankshafts and had a 5-speed gearbox. It was clearly inspired by the V-twin Grand Prix bikes, a common sight on the grids of the period. Unlike those machines, while it wasn't extraordinarily powerful at just over 100 horsepower, it was impressively light, weighing in at just 164 kilos or 361 pounds, which made the 150 mph machine rather exciting to ride. So you would have thought Bimotor would have had a major hit on its hands, but there was one small problem. It was the first machine to make use of direct injection, and getting that to work reliably proved an absolute nightmare. And ultimately machines were switched over to carburetors. The Moradelli V8. Now they must have been putting something in the water in Italy in the late 90s, because in 1997, the same year that Bimotor introduced their two-stroke, Moradelli, a company famous for its Grand Prix racing machines, announced a new road bike with a V8 engine. And with a pedigree like Moradelli's, surely this was going to be something special. A stunning piece of engineering with Italian styling. Well, as it turned out, not exactly. The Moradelli styling was certainly something of an acquired taste. How did Italian stylists manage to produce a bike quite so ugly, I've always wondered. The bike for me has always reminded me of an owl. Not surprisingly, after fairly negative press reviews, Moradelli restyled the machine, although the end result was perhaps a little bit too conservative, but it does look a lot better, I think. The engine was a liquid-cooled 90-degree V8 of 847cc with 4 valves per cylinder, producing 120 horsepower at 11,000 rpm. There was a 5-speed gearbox which was mounted to shaft final drive. All in weight was a fairly reasonable 440 pounds or 200 kilos, and top speed was around the 150 mph mark. The chassis was extremely competent and made use of the very best quality components then available. This of course all made for a very high asking price, and the bike retailed in the US for around $45,000, making it at the time the most expensive production bike in the world. If of course you could get your hands on one. Production ended in 1998 with just a handful of bikes being completed, despite the order books being full for the bike. This of course means that the bike today is very much a priceless classic. The Ducati 750 SS. The 750 Supersport was Ducati's first bevel-drive sporting V-twin. It was a development of Paul Smart's Imola-winning endurance racer of 1972. Full production of these round-case early models began in 1974, and these are by far the most desirable of the Ducati V-twins, being produced in tiny numbers for just a single year, after which it was replaced by the square case engine developed from the larger 900. This meant that just over 400 of these machines were actually constructed, making the Touring GT model highly desirable too, and unsurprisingly quite a few of the GTs have been converted into fake supersports. So this is certainly a case of buyer beware. As long as you know what you're getting, it doesn't really matter, but caution is advised. The GT is nevertheless a fine model in its own right. Later square case models, even 900 or 750, are far more numerous, so are much less desirable, but that does not mean they're not expensive. So whichever model you choose, expect a big assault on your bank account. Coventry Eagle's Flying 8. Coventry Eagle was a bicycle manufacturer established in 1897. They began to experiment with power units in their bikes as early as 1898, but would produce their first motorcycle in 1903. The company mostly produced smaller capacity bikes using Villiers engines or sometimes smaller JA Prestwick units. However, their range-topping Flying 8 would make use of the JA Prestwick V-twin 1000cc engine, producing a machine which was broadly comparable to the equivalent Brough Superiors. Following the economic downturn of 1929, the company would concentrate its efforts on its primary machines, small capacity Villiers units and bicycles. The Flying 8 would remain available, latterly with the Jap overhead valve unit, giving the machine near 100 mph performance. Motorcycle production would continue until 1939, but would not return post-war. Bicycle production did, however, continue until the company was bought out by Raleigh and subsequently wound down. The MV Augusta 750S. MV Augusta, of course, has an MV or Grand Prix racing record with 37 World Championships under their belt. On road, of course, they produced rather more humble machines, usually of smaller capacity, maxing out at a 350 parallel twin. But with the days of 4-stroke Grand Prix races numbered, there was much pressure on Count Domenico Augusta to allow the company to produce a larger capacity 4-stroke. The first result was the ugly 600 Tourer, but this was later replaced by the 750S, the bike everybody had asked for in the first place. Here was a machine with a 4-cylinder dual overhead cam unit based on the Grand Prix 500 bikes of the 1950s. The chassis was fantastic, the brakes were brilliant, and the overall styling was truly stunning. Although the use of shaft final drive certainly confused some, it made sense to the Count because it prevented the bikes being used as production racers, although a chain drive conversion would later be available. Unfortunately for MV, even by Italian standards, their manufacturing facilities were very small, so they couldn't hope to produce the machine to a level which would be in any way economically viable. So not surprisingly, despite some frantic cost cutting at the factory, the resulting motorcycle was eye-wateringly expensive, and that frantic cost cutting would come back to bite them. The chrome was of poor quality and the electrics more than a little dodgy. Not surprisingly, sales were very slow indeed, and even a later revamp model with an increase in engine capacity disc brakes and up-to-date styling couldn't turn the tide for MV Augusta. Sophisticated it may have been, but the performance for the first four was fairly disappointing, with just 115 miles an hour available as a top speed, so it was a little quicker than a British parallel twin, which was far less expensive of course, and much slower than the Japanese equivalents. The later American model would redress this in some way, courtesy of an increase in capacity and some tuning, but it was too little and too late. The Vincent HRD Repe Series A. There's no denying that Vincent HRD's machines were exotic, a sort of British Ducati if you will. Phil Vincent had founded the company in 1928 and had initially made great use of the HRD name, a name which he'd purchased following the collapse of Howard Raymond Davis's original company the previous year. Early machines made use of Jap single-cylinder engines placed on their own braze lug frame, but this would soon be superseded by an engine of their own manufacture, which would power the first Series A Comets. Legend has it that the V-twin was first devised in 1936, when Phil Irving, the designer, had the blueprints of two of his 500s sitting one on top of another, and in a moment of inspiration realised that a V-twin could be produced. Now whether the story is true or not is lost to time, but it's worth telling because it is a good story nevertheless. Within the year, Vincent had the first V-twin engine running and placed in a modified frame. The result was a 47.5 degree overhead valve 998cc V-twin. The machine ran a 6.8 to 1 compression ratio, enough for 45 horsepower and a top speed of around 110 miles an hour. And of course, prodigious amounts of torque. Rather too much torque it turned out for the Berman transmission system. The engine was something of a compromise and there were oil pipes just all over the place, leading the machine to be nicknamed the plumber's nightmare. The braze lug frame was closely based on the single-cylinder Comet, but modified to take that extra rear cylinder, and featured front and rear suspension units. Production of the Series A was halted by the Second World War, with less than 80 actually being completed. The post-war Series B would be a completely different machine, making the Series A a rare and highly desirable classic today, and is expensive even by Vincent standards. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us feature in a future video? Maybe you've got a bike we can feature in a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thanks for watching.